here at American University, and each semester we try to bring a big name speaker or a comedian to campus, and as far as atheists go, it doesn't get much bigger than Dawkins. This event wouldn't be possible tonight without the help and hard work of student activities, the Honours Program, and of course the Richard Dawkins Foundation. It also wouldn't be possible without my fellow student and avid atheist, Miguel, our mother. So to introduce Professor Richard Dawkins, please welcome Miguel. Well, first of all, I'd like to remind everyone to please make sure to turn off your cell phones. Also, if you feel the urge to add any comments or express your opinion during Professor Dawkins' responses to the questions, please don't do it. As in fact, you will have the chance to ask Professor Dawkins your questions. That being said, we expect everyone to remain respectful at all times. Let me also add a special acknowledgement to Professor Michael Mance, Director of the American University's Honors Program, for all the assistance he's provided. Also, we are grateful to Dr. Elizabeth Harlow, Director of the Richard Dawkins Foundation, for her immense support. As you all know, today we are in for a treat. We are here to celebrate science, reason, and education. As we welcome to American University the internationally celebrated, controversial, and inspiring Professor Richard Dawkins. Last semester, I had the opportunity of contributing to a small project with Professor Dawkins. I helped mediate an interview between him and the online community Reddit.com. The project was not difficult. We asked the users of the website Reddit to submit their questions for Professor Dawkins with the agreement that he will answer some of the top voted ones. In a matter of hours, thousands of users from all across the world submitted their questions. Within a few days, Dr. Dawkins and his team filmed a video full of thought-provoking answers to some of the top questions. The clip even included a very witty segment of him reading his personal hate mail in his delightful British accent. Personally, as a big admirer of Professor Dawkins' work, I find it even more inspiring to see one of the world's most influential individuals embrace this new kind of platform and be a part of it. Because by doing so, it allows several readers and fans from many corners of the world to interact with Dr. Dawkins on an almost personal level. And I think I speak for everyone who participated by saying thank you. If you are here, I assume you know who Richard Dawkins is, so I'll be brief with the introduction. Professor Dawkins is a philanthropist and a leader. He's a major donor in the free thought and science community, as well as one of the leaders of both movements. He's the retired Oxford Professor of Public Understanding of Science. He's one of the world's most renowned evolutionary biologists and scientists. And he's the famed proponent of the gene-centered view of evolution and natural selection. In addition, Professor Dawkins is the person who coined the term meme, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. He's also a best-selling author of many books. He has published 10 books, and some of the most famous are The Selfish Gene, The God Delusion, and The Greatest Show on Earth. Ladies and gentlemen, we will have a question and answer session, so I will ask you to please form lines on both sides, on both alleys, to ask your questions. We will start right up with the questions. So it is my humbling honor to introduce to you Professor Richard Dawkins.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. As Miguel has said, I don't have a prepared speech. It's my experience that people are always more interested in the Q&A part of the session anyway. And so I see nobody's exactly falling over themselves to get to the microphone. Yeah, I'll say.
Hi, my name is Jesse. I'm also a fellow atheist. I was just wondering, he mentioned that you get a lot of hate mail. I was wondering if you could recall the funniest piece of hate mail you ever got.
Oh, let me think. Well, one was, I hope you get hit by a church van. Another one was, I hope you get colon cancer and die a painful death. Christian love, you understand.
Thank you.
Mr. Dawkins, thank you very much for coming. Why is it that some people, the group of people who cite signs when discussing the threats of global warming, the problems of global warming, those same group of people, or many of them, tend to vehemently oppose other life-saving scientific breakthroughs such as vaccines and genetically modified food?
I do not know the answer to that. I don't even know if it's true, but I believe you. I mean, you've no doubt done lots of painstaking research to show that. What you're suggesting is that I think people, there may be people who are generally contrarians, and so people who tend to be anti the scientific establishment in one field may have the same sort of psychological disposition to be anti the scientific establishment in another. But there may be something more to it than that. I mean, do you have an idea yourself?
No, I mean, it's, especially on a college campus, I mean, there's a very large movement to confront the challenges of global warming. But then I also, I mean, this is completely personal and anecdotal evidence, to be honest. But it seems like many of those people will also wage wars against vaccines and more so genetically engineered food with the organic movement, which is, I personally think, ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, I think it's not that surprising that a personality type that takes a contrarian view on one thing might do on another. I've got nothing more.
Thank you.
I hope you're not too offended on that staff.
I'll just about grin and bear it.
My lit-seminar professor at Tanner Shatz, he was also faculty advisor of the AU Rationalist and Atheist, just had us finish on the origin of species. And we were all, in my class, very struck by how poignant and simple the arguments were. I was wondering what your opinion was on simplifying those arguments for school children to get them scientifically thinking rather than thinking in fantastical terms like Harry Potter seems to encourage.
Yeah. Well, as it happens, I'm just finishing a book for children, which I'm not allowed to call children. I've got to call them young adults. It's followed the market apparently we call them children. But my target age is sort of 12 and upwards. I am trying to explain not just evolution, but other aspects of science as well, and contrasting scientific explanations with mythical explanations. So that is somewhat in the forefront of my mind. One thing that strikes me is that the scientific explanations, which are so much more exciting, mythical ones are actually rather boring, because you sort of feel, well, you know, somebody just made this up around a campfire. It doesn't kind of spring from a collective unconscious or anything like that. Although I sort of put the myths in, and they are quite helpful, I hope it will show up that the scientific story really is more exciting. Darwin was a magnificent explainer. You really feel when you open the pages of The Origin of Species that you have been ushered into the presence of a great intellect who also labored mightily and sincerely to make himself understood. Not all writers really even want to be understood, I suspect. There's a certain type of intellectual who likes to be admired for profundity, and it's all too easy to mistake obscurity for profundity. I see there's a certain reaction around the room to this. I once heard a story of maybe it even happened to me. It didn't happen to me. A story of somebody who went up to a an aspiring, ambitious young professor and said, Professor so-and-so, I found your book extremely difficult to understand. Oh, thank you, he said. Darwin wasn't like that. Darwin wanted to be understood. He knew that what he had to say was deeply important, and he wanted to leave no stone unturned in order to make sure that everybody could understand it. I came to appreciate Darwin especially a few months ago when I was asked to read aloud The Origin of Species for a recording, for a CD. And in order to do that, I really had to master every sentence, because you had to know which is the right word, which is the right syllable of each word to emphasize in order to get the meaning across. It's a wonderful discipline to force yourself to read something aloud so that somebody else can understand it. In Darwin's case, I mean, Victorian English is not the same as modern English. Sentences are a bit longer, and so it was a challenge, but it was a challenge that was really, really worthwhile.
Professor Dawkins, my question is, well, if I could preface it really quickly, I was recently surveyed by a religious group, and they realized I wasn't religious. They then asked me if I was spiritual, to which I responded, what do you mean by spiritual? To which it quickly occurred to both of us that neither of us really had a concrete definition, it's just maybe an intuitive one. So my question for you is, what do you think is a useful meaning for the word spiritual? And given your answer, do you think a rationally scientific-minded person can be spiritual without there being an internal contradiction?
I think it's one of those words which can be misused, and it's a word that you can define it to mean something like what, say, Carl Sagan obviously has when contemplating the cosmos, or what I have indeed when contemplating the living kingdoms. So you have a sense of uplift, a sense of swelling in the chest, a sense of glorified in the magnificence of the universe, the magnificence of the living kingdoms. And you could call that spiritual. But there will be other people who will use the word spiritual to connote some sort of supernaturalism. And it's sometimes used as a sort of euphemism for supernatural but not subscribing to any particular religion. And so if you were to census people and say, are you spiritual? I suspect it would be an almost useless question to ask, because you get such a mixture of answers to the questions. You wouldn't really know what anybody meant. So I would be inclined just not to use the word.
Professor Victor Schultz, Department of Chemistry. Many years you've acted as an excellent, much needed liaison between the hard, sometimes rough scientific community and the non-scientific. What were some of your influences in your younger life to actually become the scientist, specifically in your field? And then what made you decide that you wanted to help everyone understand what's doing all this with your writings and other discoveries?
I suppose the dominant influence to me in becoming a biologist in the first place, it was a more than gifted interest without much of a positive influence. And then I became deeply enthused in my second year as an undergraduate at Oxford, where at Oxford we have the tutorial system where undergraduates are sent away for a week with a reading list into the library. A reading list not of textbooks, never textbooks, but original research literature. So that was my first exposure to what it's like to bury yourself in the research literature, to follow trails of literature, research papers, to get a feel for what it's like actually to do research or to read about other people's original research, and then write an essay about it. And so it was a heady experience for a young man of 19, 18, 20 to read up in great detail a particular subject for a week, read up the original research literature, and so become, in effect, a sort of world authority on that minor subject as an 18-year-old. And that's quite a heady experience, as I say, and that really, really inspired me. And so although the subject that I was studying for a week was incredibly narrow, so that I wasn't sort of learning to be a broad, prompted natural scientist, I did get a feel for the love of science. And then in my penultimate term, I was tutored by the Nobel Prize-winning ethologist Nico Tinbergen, and I was inspired by him to want to work with him for my doctorate. And so I suppose he would have been the dominant influence to pull me into the study of animal behavior. There was at Oxford a very strong evolutionary tradition, the study of natural selection, and evolution pervaded virtually all my weekly essays as an undergraduate. And when I reached my middle 30s, I wanted to write a book about evolution, and I wrote The Selfish Gene, and that became quite a good seller. It sold well. And that gave me the taste for explaining science to lay people, and I continue to do that with several succeeding books.
Good evening, thank you, Professor Dawkins. Speaking of heady experiences, an uncanny percentage of people that consume the hallucinogenic drug DMT claim to meet God. I just wanted to know your perspective as an atheist about the matter.
What's the name of the drug again?
DMT. Some of our cohorts over at Georgetown were caught.
That's not the one my friend Ted Haggard is on, is it? No, well, I know nothing about that. It wouldn't, I mean, from a philosophical point of view, it wouldn't surprise me if a drug forced somebody to have religious experiences. I allowed myself to be subjected to the method of Michael, help me, is that Canadian? Persinger. Michael Persinger, who puts helmets on people and passes magnetic fields through the brain. And I think something like 80% of subjects have something like a religious or spiritual experience. And I went into this sincerely hoping for something like a feeling of oneness with the universe or something of that sort, which is the kind of thing that people on some drugs also describe. Nothing whatever happened to me. I proved to be one of the 20% who was resistant to the technique. This was a BBC television production. That's what I was doing it for. And not being terribly good scientists, they had a single control who was a local vicar. So he went into the chamber immediately after I did. And he too claimed to have no sort of experience, no religious experience. But Persinger's team told me afterwards that actually his EEG record showed him to be one of an absolute prime subject for this technique, and his EEG showed quite clearly that he was having a maximal dose of this religious experience. But that as soon as it started, his EEG rhythm started to show that he was deliberately cutting it out by doing something like, I don't know, reciting multiplication tables or something in order to stop it. For some reason, he didn't want it to be demonstrated that magnetic fields could induce religious experiences, although he was a religious man. So I And I'm not saying I'm going to offer to try your drug. I didn't mind trying Persinger's motorcycle helmet with magnetic field, but it didn't work for me. I wish it had. Not that I expected to experience God, but I expected to experience a sort of atheistic equivalent of something which the previous questioner might be called spiritual. Cool, thank you.
It's going to be hard to follow that one. One thing that interests me is the complexity of the human brain, and the point really hit home to me when I was watching that computer Watson win on Jeopardy, because what I found interesting was it knew like factual information, it could recall things quicker than most humans could, but it didn't understand wordplay, sarcasm, irony, and those seem like very trivial things, but I thought that's kind of what makes the human brain unique. And what I'm wondering is, how far away are we from developing a computer that could be as sophisticated as the human brain?
Yes, well, I don't know Watson, and I don't know Jeopardy, but I understand the sort of your question. I mean, as you know, a computer program is very good at playing chess. And there was a wager, I think it was Donald Mickey, made a bet sometime in the 70s that within the next 10 years a computer program would beat a grandmaster. And I mean, as you know, that has now happened. So something like chess, something like solving logic problems is something that computer programs are extremely good at. But you are right that things like irony are much harder. The famous Turing test, I think it was when was that? Must have been in the 1950s, presumably. Alan Turing proposed a test for human capability, human-like capability in a computer, and the Turing test was that in those days computers communicated by teleprinter. And so you had a human subject sitting in a room with a teleprinter, communicating by teleprinter with either a human in another room or a computer in another room. And you didn't know which. And the task was to work out, by having a typewritten conversation, whether he was dealing with a computer or a human. And the Turing test has been the sort of litmus test for this. And I think it's true to say that if you start going into things like irony and sarcasm and so on, that only humans pass the Turing test. There are famous programs. There's a psychoanalytic program called ELIZA, a very old program, which fooled a number of people by pretending to be a psychoanalytic therapist. And it did it by reflecting back on the patient his own words. So if the patient said, "God, I'm fed up," Eliza would say, "Why are you fed up?" Then the patient would say, "My boyfriend doesn't understand me." So Eliza would say, "What would it mean to you if your boyfriend understood you?" But it wouldn't be that difficult if you weren't clever to outwit Eliza. But the thing was, the patients didn't want to. I mean, they seemed to actively want to believe that Eliza was really conscious therapist. It is a big mystery. I mean, the optimists who forecast that by now computers would have, I mean, after all, HAL 2001, we're way past 2001 now. And no computer program has reached the stage that HAL. I mean, philosophically, I'm committed to the view that there's nothing impossible about a man-made mechanical device simulated with human consciousness. But it hasn't happened yet, and it raises all sorts of moral and ethical questions.
Hi, Professor Dawkins. I'm personally an atheist, but I've had a lot of conversations with very rational and intelligent people who do believe in God. And what seems to be the connection is that that they have a extra sensory, sense of that, a sort of feeling of something above us, right? And I guess what I'm wondering is, since our senses only allow us to perceive things of this world, and God would be a metaphysical thing, that do you believe that we're able to say one way or another that God exists or not?
Well, I don't think you can ever say for certain that anything does not exist.
Yeah.
When you talk about, did you say something of telepathic communication or something like that?
I'm not quite sure because I haven't ever experienced it, but a lot of people talk about this, sense of God. They, like Pascal talks about being touched by God. Some people are just touched by God.
I mean, I'm stupendously unimpressed by such things. And you know perfectly well what the human brain is capable of in being fooled, in deluding itself, in thinking that it hears voices, all that kind of thing. So I mean that's the last reason I would think in God would be that sort of hallucination. I'm not even clear what it would even mean to talk about a supernatural event, because what would have appeared to be supernatural to somebody in the pre-scientific age would be anything that we have today. I mean, a mobile telephone, a computer, Boeing 747, all these things would undoubtedly have looked supernatural to a medieval or dark age peasant. And so if I were confronted with what purported to be evidence of something supernatural, my first thought would be, well, I'm a medieval peasant being faced with some technology that I'm unfamiliar with. So I not only do I not know of any evidence for the existence of God, I actually am increasingly finding it hard to imagine any evidence that could convince me of the existence of God.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Dawkins. My question has to do with the relative high rates of religion in the United States relative to the Western world and the acceptance of evolutionary theory. As you could probably tell, America relative to the Western world and other countries, the UK, Sweden, we're a very religious society, and there has been a lot of controversy in American public schools over the teaching of evolution. Do you believe that there is any way that American schools can possibly accept evolution, and is there any way to perhaps increase access to knowledge of evolution to the American public? Do you believe there's a reason the American public seems so skeptical of evolution?
Yeah, it's a rather shocking thing, and I constantly meet it. I mean, just this morning we had a large breakfast meeting at which there was a young woman, I think she was 16, who said that at her school, her high school, all three of her science teachers did not believe in evolution. And worse than that, they ridiculed her for her belief in evolution. And these were apparently paid a salary by the state government to teach science. And I feel almost in despair, and I invited this young woman to sit down with me with a video camera, and we had a conversation together, at which I said what I thought of her teachers. and we're going to put this on YouTube. But that's a tiny drop in the ocean. And I mean, naively one thinks, well, all you've got to do is present people with the evidence, because the evidence is massively overwhelming. But presumably somebody who is teaching science has have done some sort of science training, and somebody teaching biology, how could you possibly earn a qualification to teach biology without having been presented with the evidence? So does this mean that they have been presented with the evidence but have somehow rejected it for religious dogmatic grounds? Or is it possible that they were never presented with the evidence in the first place? I find it very hard to imagine that anybody who's actually been exposed to the evidence could possibly fail to be convinced by it. And part of the problem may be that they've been brought up to believe that they have a choice between evolution and God. Now, I actually personally happen to think that that really is the choice, but there are plenty of Christians who don't. And so the first thing probably to say is you don't have to choose between God and evolution. You can have both. And an awful lot of people in America, I've noticed, don't have never been exposed to that idea. An idea which is, it's awkward for me because I happen to find that idea false. But I'm not supposed to say that. And you could refer them to people like the NCSC, the National Committee for Science Education in Oakland, California, who are very keen to push the idea that there is absolutely no incompatibility between religion and evolution.
Thank you for spending this evening with us, sir. I'm actually going to ask you a question in light of being a person who believes in God and evolution. So I'm I'm going to push you a little bit on, what the connection is there. But so Thomas Aquinas, who wrote in the 13th century, used Aristotelian philosophy to talk about a distinction between creation and change. So the way we understand it today, science studies change. It studies the material changes in the world. But science per se doesn't necessarily speak about where those changes come from originally. I believe that Genesis teaches Christians to believe in an existence where there's a temporal beginning and end. But I believe that reason can teach us that the universe has to have been created. Now, there's a distinction between the timelessness of the universe, or maybe timedness of the universe, and the createdness of the universe. Do you accept that distinction? And if so, can you talk about that?
Well, I don't understand why you would bother to bring Genesis into it, since you know very well that Genesis was written by an ignorant person who knew nothing compared to what we know today. So you can run your argument. You can run your argument without bringing Genesis.
No, I agree that the Genesis account does not hold up. It is not fully rational.
Well, why even mention it?
I attempted to make a distinction between the Genesis account, which proves that which argues that there is a specific creation in time of the universe, and a purely rational understanding that sees the universe as created but timeless.
Well, I don't understand why you mention Genesis.
Can you address my specific question?
I could if I understood it.
Okay, so we'll start over then. So some see the universe as the Christian understanding of the universe is both created and sort of created in time, so as a definite beginning and a definite end, right? I'll give to you that it's a matter of faith that the universe has. That it's a matter of faith to see the universe as having a specific beginning and end. So there might not be a rational argument for the timedness of the universe.
So there's evidence the universe had a beginning.
So the context of my question came from what Stephen Hawking argued in his most recent book, where he says that because supposedly he's proven that the Big Bang wasn't the beginning, that we can just simply go back and back and back. So giving that to him, and I'm assuming you would agree with that view, can we make a distinction between stating whether or not the universe exists in time and whether or not it's created, if we understand God to be outside of time?
I mean, you're talking a language which means nothing to me.
I would hope that if you're going to answer the most important question, which is does God exist, you would understand basic Aristotelian metaphysics.
I don't know what you mean by timelessness. I don't know what you mean by created.
So have you not? Can you at least? So you've never read the terms. You don't understand. I mean, do you reject the terms, or do you not? Well, then, if you have nothing more to say, that's fine. I would just encourage you to read what Aquinas and Aristotle say about this.
Well, maybe I'll get around to it.
I have a lot of respect for your views, but I really think that Aquinas is probably the heaviest intellectual force that has something to say against your view, so it would probably be worth considering.
Well, does he write in a lucid fashion?
It's quite ordered, actually. It's laid out in question and answer form. I think you would find it quite well ordered.
Quite what?
I think you would find his Summa Theologica quite well ordered.
Well ordered. Okay, well, I'll see if I can get around to it at some point.
I'll look for an essay in response to his views. Thank you.
I don't think my question is going to be that provocative, but I guess I do have a comment before. I did come from a school where my AP Bio teacher did not believe in evolution. In fact, we had a debate. I was one of 4 people that believed in evolution. They started reciting Bible passages. I started eating my notebook.
4 people in how many?
Class of like 30.
Okay.
Not really the question, but I guess as a biologist, no offense, I'm not really interested in the atheist stuff. I'm a biologist first and foremost. But as a biologist, how would you explain the emergence of consciousness?
Well, clearly it's got. I mean, it's something that brains produce. But as to the distinction between a conscious being, which all of us know we are, we all of us know what it feels like to be conscious, to feel what it's like to pick up a bottle, to feel what it's like to see that you've got a green lid. These are subjective experiences which, as I said in answer to the previous question, we have no reason to think that computers can yet do. And so there is a mystery attaching to where consciousness comes from in the evolution of brains. Clearly, it is something that emerges from brains. At what point in the evolution of the brain, we don't know. Are earthworms conscious? Are lizards conscious? We don't know that. It's not even clear what the Darwinian survival value of consciousness is, because you can run a highly complicated behaving machine that behaves in such a way as to survive and reproduce as a robot without actually knowing what it's doing in the conscious sense. And so, at least that one can make a case that you can. And so, you could imagine natural selection shaping animals that behave in ways that are as complex as the animals we actually see, but without being internally aware of what they're doing. And so we're faced with the dilemma of, is that really true, or are there some things that we actually do need consciousness for, or could it all be run without consciousness? And various evolutionists have speculated in different ways about what the answer to that might be. Nicholas Humphrey, for example, some years ago, speculated that what he called the inner eye was a kind of sense organ looking inwards at the workings of oneself as a way of second-guessing what other animals, social rivals, for example, or members of the opposite sex, were about to be next. Obviously, it's of great survival value to be able to anticipate what your fellow species members are about to do. And Humphrey's idea was that the quickest way to second guess what a rival or a sexual partner might do is to look in at yourself. Well, I don't know whether that's convincing or not, but that's the kind of speculation that evolutionists have come up with in trying to answer the question about the evolutionary origins of consciousness. But as I said before, I find it even quite a difficult philosophical question to wonder what consciousness is and why you can't just run a complicated animal as a robot.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for coming here today. My question is, as a prominent English atheist, I was wondering if you're friendly at all with Christopher Hitchens and what your thoughts are on him.
Well, I know him. I wouldn't claim to be a very close friend. I've only got to know him in the last few years. I have boundless admiration for him. I think he's a most courageous man. He's, I think without exception, the most eloquent person I've ever heard. He's highly intelligent, highly educated, immensely erudite, a formidable opponent. You don't want to have him on the other side in any argument. And I wish him well in the terrible ordeal that he's now going through. I'm sure he will be.
Hi, Professor. I'm also not an atheist. My question has to do with human evolution. The question is, given the most recent discovery from discovery of Lucy and Africa to the most recent one for the Arctic Atheist Apparatus, how close do you think humanity is to accurately mapping the timeline between modern man and the common ancestors of chimpanzees and bonobos?
Well, the evidence from molecular clocks suggests that the common ancestor of chimpanzees lived about 6 or 7 million years ago. And the fossils around that time are not good. The Ardipithecus that you mentioned is about 4 million years ago, which is not old enough. Then you've got Orrin and the Chad fossil, which are about 6 million years ago, which don't really quite fit the bill as the common ancestor. So there are presumably lots more fossils out there to be found, and it's a very flourishing field of research. The molecular evidence seems to leave little doubt about the dating of that common ancestor. There are, as you know, no fossils at all, I think, on the chimpanzee side. There are quite a few fossils on the human side. So I think we must just look for more fossils. On the molecular front, I suppose, looking rather futuristically, we now have the human genome decoded and the chimpanzee genome decoded, and so I suppose it would be in principle possible to sort of extrapolate backwards and construct various possible hybrid genomes between humans and chimpanzees. Maybe the embryological technology of not too distant future might enable us to reconstruct a sort of halfway stage between the human and the chimpanzee, which would not be the common ancestor, but which might give some sort of idea of what the common ancestor would be like. There are many who would say that was an extremely unethical thing to do.
Hi, Professor Dawkins. Thank you again for coming. The question is about the atheist movement in countries which are not the United Kingdom and the United States, and how do you think they're developing? We see like the four riders of the apocalypse being all either from the United States or Britain, and how they're not very connected to other parts of the world where the movement is also spreading. So I just wanted to know your connections with organizations in, say, Latin America, maybe Africa, and seeing how is that developing? Do you have any knowledge of it?
Yes, I don't have any very good connections with or similar organizations in either Latin America or Africa. I have the impression that both those continents are a lot more religious than Europe, certainly, and even in America. I think it's probably those are probably areas that we should be reaching out to.
If I missed something else in that suggestion, the questions that were talked before about consciousness. Many times we're trying to debate citing your books and what you write about. One of the main criticisms that you have is that you are a biologist. You're not a say philosopher like say Daniel Dennett, which is by the way, if anyone's interested, very smart person on the psychology of consciousness. So you might be able to answer.
Yes, I mean I do have great admiration for Daniel Dennett, and I've read his book Consciousness Explained, which I recommend.
So I just wanted to know what are your thoughts on the criticisms that they make to you that you should focus more on the biological part of atheism rather than try to answer questions to the more philosophical part of atheism. Yeah. Which I think you're right, but I think there's a gap of knowledge there.
And I've never really understood what that means, and you know, what are these philosophical points that one ought to be talking about? And I understand Daniel Dennett because he's more or less become a scientist, but I don't know anything more to say.
I'm a journalism student, so not surprisingly, my question has to do with language and public discourse. I'm sure a lot of people here have arguments about terminology that one might use to identify oneself as a non-believer. I actually had a great argument with a friend about you personally because he was railing against the use of the term atheist as logically inconsistent. I think Sam Harris recently mentioned that he pointedly avoids using the term. So basically my question was for your thoughts on the terminology of public discourse, and does it even matter? What do you think?
Well, Sam Harris, as you say, makes the interesting point that we shouldn't need to use the term atheist. We don't bother to say we are atheist or atheorists. And there will come a time when the word atheist will become redundant because we will all believe in things for which there's evidence. And so there won't be any need to declare that we don't believe in things for which there's no evidence. So he's got a point. On the other hand, since we live in a world where I suppose the majority of the population are theists, then it is a word that has a certain usefulness.
Well, I guess the question I was trying to make is that with this, for example, the argument I had was my friend saying that agnostic is a more logically, scientifically accurate way to describe yourself in the absence.
Yes, okay, that's a separate point, and it's in many ways that valid one. Once again, to refer to fairies and thorns, I mean, we are all agnostic with respect to fairies. We can't prove that fairies don't exist, but we don't bother with fairies because we've never seen any evidence for it. So call yourself agnostic by all means. If you add that you're also agnostic about the Easter Bunny and Mother Goose, etc.
Do you think that terms are therefore just pretty much interchangeable on a practical level?
Yes. Where they're not interchangeable is where people use the word agnostic to mean somebody who thinks that because we think that it's sort of a kind of 50-50 bet, which I mean a lot of people do. A lot of people say you cannot either prove or disprove God. Therefore, you might as well toss a penny. And that kind of agnostic, I think we can do better than. We can put a probability value on it, which in my case would be far off towards the zero. One more question, I hope.
Oh, hello. Mr. Dawkins, I've been following you for a little while, and there were a couple of questions raised, or at least that you brought up in the talk that I'd like to raise. You claim evidence is necessary for truth. Is this correct?
Yes or no? Yeah. Okay. All right. Because you claim a moral or ethical dilemma a while ago, and I was wondering if you have any evidence or proof for your morals or your ethics.
No, but nor does anybody else, if you're going to put it that way. I mean, morals, we can ask where they come from, and we can agree that the great majority of people have certain moral principles, like the golden rule, don't be cruel, don't torture, etc. And if you ask where those come from, you can give historical answers, you can give biological answers. You can't actually prove logically that it's wrong to eat people, or that it's wrong to have slaves and whip them. That's not a thing you can logically prove. But when one says that atheists have no basis for believing that cannibalism or slavery are wrong, religious people don't have any logical basis for it either. And so we're all in this together, and we need to sit down together and agree upon what our moral standards are. And we pretty much do agree. And what's very striking to me is that those moral standards change in a rather rapid, predictable, directed way as the decades go by. And this is true whether we're religious or not. And if you look at things that are treated as moral today, and treated as moral 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, there's a definite progressive trend, which is true of everybody here, regardless of whether they're religious or not.
If I might directly respond, Tim Keller wrote a book in response to the God delusion called The Reason for God, and in it he mentioned the grand question in response to your conclusion for moral ambiguity, essentially, is that who determines this? If you just say that we all have kind of a collective morality, then who decides that, per se?
Well, I have no answer to that, nor does he. Because if you're going to say you get your answer to that from religion, well, I sincerely hope you don't. Because if you get it from religion, then you're getting it from really hideous sources, such as the Bible or the Quran. So you better not do that. Or your moral only, as I've met people say this, that the only reason they refrain from killing or raping is they're afraid of God. That's not the kind of person I want to